There is a steak sitting in the Walmart meat case right now that almost nobody picks up. No sign above it, no marketing behind it. It goes by different names depending on the store and the region, which is part of why it stays invisible. I spent 40 years behind a butcher block, and the people who knew exactly what this cut was used to pull it off the processing line and take it home before the shift ended. That is not a legend, that is documented industry practice, and it tells you everything about the gap between what gets sold and what gets kept. This video covers 4 things: what the cut actually is, why it behaves like the steak next to it that costs 3 times as much, how to find it without getting fooled by a lookalike, and how to cook it right. Everything else is noise. Chuck eye steak is cut from the 5th rib. That address matters more than it sounds. Ribeyes come from the 6th rib through the 12th, the rib primal, the section the industry has built its premium steak marketing around for decades. The 5th rib sits at the exact boundary between the chuck primal and the rib primal, which means the chuck eye is 1 rib removed from where the ribeye begins. They are direct neighbors on the animal. Both cuts share the same primary muscle, the longissimus dorsi. Chuck eye comes from the chuck section of that muscle, ribs 1 through 5. Ribeye comes from the rib section, ribs 6 through 12. Same muscle, a different point along its length, and a price difference that has nothing to do with the muscle itself and everything to do with which primal name ends up on the label. The shoulder works harder than the rib section does. That is not a flaw in the cut, it is anatomy. The chuck end of the longissimus dorsi carries slightly more connective tissue and a marginally firmer texture than its neighbor, because the shoulder does more work during the animal's life than the rib section does. That difference is real, and this script will not pretend otherwise. Now the number that explains why you have never seen this cut marketed aggressively. There are exactly 2 chuck eye steaks per animal, 1 per side. That is the total yield from an entire steer. The industry cannot build a national marketing campaign around 2 steaks per carcass. So it never tried. The cut stays quiet because the math on making it loud never worked in anyone's favor. The flavor similarity between chuck eye and ribeye is not coincidence, and it is not marketing. It is anatomy. They share the longissimus dorsi, and they also share a second muscle, the spinalis dorsi, the ribeye cap. The cap is the narrow band that runs along the outer edge of a ribeye, and it is the reason serious ribeye eaters often prefer the end closest to it. More fat, more flavor, a texture that reads as almost separate from the main muscle underneath. Chuck eye carries a portion of that same cap. How much depends on exactly where the cut sits on the 5th rib. The closer to the rib section, the more spinalis is present. That is why rib placement matters when you are at the counter, and why asking for a cut from the 5th rib specifically, rather than taking whatever is in the tray, is worth the extra 30 seconds. Marbling is present on a well-sourced chuck eye and visible to the eye. Every honest source frames it the same way, similar to ribeye, measurably less, not identical. One industry-facing estimate puts chuck eye at roughly 80 to 90% of the tenderness of a ribeye. That is a sourced estimate, not a lab result, and this script treats it as one. What it reflects is the eating experience reported consistently by people who have cooked both cuts side by side. The gap is real. It is also small enough that at the price difference we are about to discuss, it stops mattering to most people immediately. Ribeye in the USDA choice grade runs roughly $14 to $22 a pound at retail. USDA Prime runs $22 to $35. For a documented point of comparison, at Safeway, a 1-pound USDA choice boneless chuck eye steak was priced at $10.99. The USDA boneless prime ribeye next to it ran $35.99. That is more than 300% more expensive for a steak cut from the muscle directly adjacent to this one. Chuck eye at retail runs approximately $7 to $12 a pound across the broader market. That is a 50 to 70% savings per pound compared to its neighbor on the label. The title of this video mentions Walmart specifically. I will be direct about what I can and cannot tell you. No source I have seen confirms a verified current per-pound price for chuck eye at Walmart. If that number appears on screen in this video, it came from an actual in-store check, not a figure I invented. What I can tell you is that the range holds regardless of the retailer. $7 against $22 is the same argument at Walmart, at Safeway, or at any other store that carries this cut. The arithmetic does not change by zip code. The gap between what this steak costs and what its neighbor costs is not a rounding error. It is the distance between a cut with 2 units per animal and one with a full marketing budget. The phrase "butcher's steak" is not folklore. It has a named source. Jason Jerome, a beef supply chain expert at Beef. Its "What's for Dinner" is on record describing how chuck eye steaks earned that nickname. Butchers used to pull this cut off the line for themselves before it reached the case, because it cooked and tasted like a ribeye while costing a fraction of the price. That is the attribution. Quote the source, use the claim, move on. What it tells you is that the people with the most direct knowledge of what a beef carcass contains made a revealed preference, and their preference was this cut over the ones they were selling. That is not a minor detail. A butcher who keeps the best value steak for himself and puts the expensive neighbor in the display case is not doing anything dishonest. He is exercising knowledge the person on the other side of the glass does not have. The institutional dynamic is plain. Information about what actually represents value inside a carcass has always lived closest to the people who break it down. It did not flow outward because there was no financial incentive for it to flow outward. A counter that sells chuck eye at $7 loses margin it could have captured selling ribeye at $22. The knowledge gap is not accidental. It is the natural outcome of a system where the seller understands the product better than the buyer, and the seller's interest is not the buyer's interest. The butcher was not hiding anything. He simply was not telling you, and you were not asking. Chuck eye is one of several cuts that have historically been sold under the name Delmonico steak. The others include boneless ribeye, top loin, New York strip, and top sirloin. The USDA never standardized the term, which is why all 5 definitions remain in active use today and why the same word means something different depending on which butcher, which shop, and which region of the country you are in. Boneless ribeye is the most commonly cited modern interpretation. Chuck eye is the lowest priced of the 5 by a meaningful margin, and the one most likely to surprise a customer who ordered a Delmonico expecting a premium experience and received one at a fraction of the usual cost. The point is not that restaurants are secretly serving budget cuts under expensive names. It is that the same label has covered meaningfully different beef for well over a century, and the USDA never resolved it. A customer who knows this can look at a Delmonico listing and ask which cut it actually is. Most customers do not know to ask. They see the name and assume the price is explained by the name. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the name is covering a chuck eye that a trained butcher priced accurately and a customer walked past because it did not look expensive enough to be worth buying. That is the whole story. Chuck eye is not always sold under its own name, and that is the first obstacle. Depending on the store and the region, you might find it labeled boneless chuck shoulder center cut steak, boneless chuck fillet, Delmonico steak, shoulder steak, London broil, or English steak. The name printed on the package is not a reliable guide. What is reliable is the visual. A true chuck eye looks like a steak, one cohesive muscle, typically thicker than a standard ribeye, bright cherry red with visible white marbling distributed evenly through it. That combination tells you far more than the label does. At a large chain grocery store, including Walmart, the cut is unlikely to be labeled chuck eye directly. Knowing the alternative names and being able to recognize the look is more useful than searching for a single specific term on the package. At an independent butcher with a full-time cutter, ask for the chuck eye by name and specify the fifth rib. A butcher who knows his inventory well will know exactly what that means. One who does not is telling you something useful about what he is actually cutting back there. Call ahead before you go. The phone call takes 3 minutes and saves a wasted trip. If the butcher knows the cut, that conversation usually goes somewhere worth having. Cutters who know their product tend to have opinions about it, and those opinions are generally worth considerably more than anything printed on a case card. The counter is not self-explanatory. It consistently rewards the person who asks. The label says, "Chuck and you think you are buying the same thing in a different size." You are not. True chuck eye steak comes from the fifth rib, one cohesive muscle, tender enough to cook directly over high heat. It behaves like a steak because it is one. A generic chuck steak or chuck roast comes from elsewhere in the same primal and is a fundamentally different product. Multiple muscles connected by large chunks of fat and dense connective tissue built for low heat over a long time. Cook it like a steak, and you are fighting the meat and losing. The connective tissue does not soften fast enough. The muscles contract at different rates, and what comes off the pan is tough regardless of what temperature you pulled it at. The reverse error matters equally. Take a real chuck eye and braise it, and you have wasted the single quality that makes it worth finding. The tenderness that comes from the fifth rib does not survive a long braise. You paid for a steak and made a stew ingredient out of it. The visual is your best guide. A chuck eye looks like a single cohesive steak, one muscle, marbled, intact. A generic chuck cut looks layered, fatty, and multi-muscled. They are not the same cut, even when the label puts the same word on both of them. 2 methods. Reverse sear first, because it gives the most control and produces the most consistent result on a cut like this. Preheat the oven to 250 degrees. Season the steak. Salt and pepper is sufficient. This cut has enough flavor that it does not need a marinade, and if you use one, keep anything acid-based under 2 hours or the texture starts to suffer. Place the steak on a wire rack over a baking sheet and put it in the oven. Pull it when the internal temperature is 10 to 15 degrees below your target doneness. For medium rare, that means pulling somewhere around 115 to 120 degrees. Transfer immediately to a cast iron skillet with high smoke point oil already at temperature. Sear 1 to 2 minutes per side until a deep brown crust forms across the surface. The mechanism? The low oven dries the surface as it brings the interior up gradually, so by the time the steak reaches the pan, it is nearly moisture-free on the outside and ready to brown the moment it makes contact. No steaming, no lost surface moisture, no fighting the pan temperature. The sear builds crust and flavor. It does not seal in juices. That idea has been wrong for a long time, and this script will not repeat it. Finish with a butter baste if you want. The direct sear method works for a cook comfortable with tighter timing. Cast iron at temperature, high smoke point oil, sear hard on each side, then add butter, garlic, and fresh thyme and baste continuously for the last minute. Pull at 125 degrees for medium rare. Rest 5 to 10 minutes before slicing. Slice against the grain. The USDA's recommended minimum internal temperature for beef steaks is 145 degrees with a 3-minute rest. Many cooks pull chuck eye earlier for medium rare. Both facts belong in the same sentence. The reason chuck eye stays obscure is not quality. It is arithmetic. 2 steaks per animal is not a volume that supports a marketing campaign. The beef industry spends its promotional budget on cuts it can move at scale. Ribeye, New York strip, tenderloin, ground beef. These are cuts with enough units per carcass to justify shelf space, case signs, and national advertising. A cut yielding 2 pieces from an entire steer does not survive that filter, so it gets folded into roasts, sold under inconsistent names at whatever the counter decides to call it, or bypassed entirely in favor of something easier to move in volume. The grocery store's incentive structure pushes in the same direction. A retailer who converts a customer from a $20 ribeye to a $7 chuck eye does not benefit from that conversion. The margin goes down. The knowledge required to make the sale goes up. There is no version of that math that favors putting a well-lit sign above the chuck eye case explaining what it is and why it represents better value than its neighbor. The display case is a margin exercise, not an education. What is prominent is profitable. What delivers value and what gets promoted are frequently different questions with different answers, and the case is organized around the first concern, not the second. The Every Chef uses it framing in this video's title is grounded in two documented things: the historical Delmonico substitution, where the same name covered this cut at a fraction of the price of its premium stablemates, and the butcher's steak origin, where the people closest to the carcass consistently chose this cut for themselves when given the option. That is not a marketing claim. That is a revealed preference from the people who knew the most. The steak case is organized around margin, not value. That has always been true, and it will not change. What changes is whether the person standing in front of it knows enough to look past the label and price sign and ask what the cut is and where it actually comes from. The gap between a $7 steak and a $20 steak is not always a quality gap. Sometimes it is a gap in yield per animal, marketing budget, and how many people knew to ask for it by name. Now you know. Subscribe if you want the rest of what I know, because 40 years behind the block left me with considerably more of it than one video holds.